Hello and welcome to the Wednesday, July 9th, 2025 edition of the SANS Internet Storm Center's Stormcast. My name is Johannes Ulrich, and this episode brought to you by the SANS.edu Credit Certificate Program in Cloud Security is recorded in Jacksonville, Florida. Well, of course, today we have to start with Microsoft Patch Tuesday. We got our July patches from Microsoft. Microsoft released a total of 139 patches. Now, 130 of those vulnerabilities are in Microsoft's own software. We had 7 vulnerabilities in Git, interestingly, that were included in this update, and then 2 Chrome and with that Microsoft Edge related vulnerabilities that were actually already released a couple of days ago. Among the vulnerabilities that Microsoft patched, I think there are 5 that I would sort of consider noteworthy. I started out here with the Microsoft Office vulnerabilities. There are 2 vulnerabilities that are critical, that are remote code execution vulnerabilities, and where Microsoft considers exploitation more likely, meaning that these are not super complex exploits. The reason they are rated critical instead of important is that they don't require any user interaction. The user does not have to actually open the document. This is exploitable just via the preview feature. Then next, we do have a vulnerability in the Microsoft SQL Server. Actually, 2 vulnerabilities. The one is information disclosure vulnerability. What's sort of interesting about this is that, first of all, it has already been made public. And to patch the vulnerability, you actually have to patch the OLE database driver. Then the second SQL Server vulnerability, I consider kind of interesting, even though it hasn't been released yet, but it's a remote code execution vulnerability. And with that, it's, of course, critical. Not really sure how likely it is that something like this is being exploited, but Microsoft thinks it's less likely. But take it as an additional sort of motivation to make sure that your SQL servers are not exposed. And the last vulnerability here is a command or code injection vulnerability in SharePoint. We typically have cross-site scripting vulnerabilities in SharePoint, but this is an outright code injection vulnerability. So basically arbitrary command execution vulnerability. However, an attacker first must be authenticated in order to exploit this vulnerability. So just a random user coming to a SharePoint site looking for some content is not going to be able to exploit this. I don't think there's sort of any big critical or must patch now vulnerability here in this set. So as usual, I would say just follow your patch procedure, test these patches carefully before you actually release them to your users. But as always, make sure you get this done before next Patch Tuesday. And before we talk about some of the other patches that were released today from companies other than Microsoft, let's first talk about a little new TLS issue that was released today. And well, I at least want to mention it because often these TLS issues will cause quite a bit of press and such, so you kind of have an idea of what it's all about. They call it the Opposum Attack. And in this attack, in order to be vulnerable, the server has to use a very specific configuration. RFC 2817 is sort of specifying this. And what this configuration does is it allows HTTP and HTTPS connections on the same port, usually on port 80. In Apache, you can configure that by configuring the SSL engine as optional versus as on, as you would do in a TLS only scenario. So this is not a very common scenario. The more common option is where you have a web server list on port 80 that will redirect users to port 443 to HTTPS instead. That's the safer configuration. And part of the problem here is that you basically allow HTTP and HTTPS connections on the same port. The way an attacker would exploit this is by first sending a request to the server on port 80, basically just a plain HTTP request. The server, of course, will respond in this case with the 101 status code, basically asking the client to resend that request via HTTPS. The next thing that happens now is that the actual client, the actual user, is connecting to the server. And one way this could potentially work here is that the attacker would just delay the request. So the attacker is not able here to decrypt any of the data. The TLS handshake then happens between the legitimate client, the legitimate server, and then again, the attacker is delaying or blocking the first GET request. The server still has the response for the initial GET request, so it will now essentially respond with the wrong response, and the client is getting like a different page than they asked for. That's all it is. So there is no decryption involved. The main effect is that the user would get the wrong page in return, which could still cause quite a bit of problems. But it's only an issue if you're using this very specific configuration. And there appears to be no fix if you really want both HTTP and HTTPS to be on the same port, and then use the 101 switch protocol and the upgrade headers in order to switch between HTTP and HTTPS. And one company that also started in recent months to always release updates on the second Tuesday of the month is Ivanty. And this month in particular, interesting here, Endpoint Manager, they fixed 3 vulnerabilities. 2 of these vulnerabilities deal with the improper use of encryption, which essentially allows users to decrypt each other's passwords. The third vulnerability is a SQL injection vulnerability. Now, this one does require that the attacker is authenticated with admin privileges and then can read arbitrary data from the database. That could actually then, together with the first 2 vulnerabilities, be used then to retrieve the encrypted passwords and then decrypt them. Even administrators should not be able to decrypt or have access to users' passwords. Well, and this is it for today. So thanks for listening and hope to see you in DC next week and talk to you again tomorrow. Bye.